You take an extensive roster of over-the-top powerful characters like in Fate and you put them into a Royal Rumble of meat smacking. Then you add in some political intrigue with mastermind plans behind the scenes, you sprinkle in some isekai elements and perhaps even some gory elements with a bit of horror, and you end up with Ishura. From the premise alone, this show seemed right up my alley. While looking up the synopsis for the upcoming shows, I thought this would be one of my favorite anime to watch this season, and yet it's not. Is Ishura good? Is it bad? Do I recommend it? Let's get right into it. If you saw my winter season preview, you'll know that I was very surprised at how low Ishura scored on my anime list, and I presumed, looking at the tags, that perhaps the first episode was too gory and just scared people away. While I was right on the money that the first episode is in fact perhaps a bit too gory, I don't think it was just the extra gore that drew viewers away. Ishura is in many ways a hot pot of main characters, and so the introductions really only stop at around half the season, and while there are characters that are more relevant than others, there isn't really a single character that we can point towards and say, that's the MC, and that is very unusual for anime these days. There are pros and cons to having this expansive world and relying on multiple points of views of different characters, which can be very interesting, but it also has a very hard task, which is to keep the viewer's attention in the early episodes while having these jarring character switches, and I don't think that Ishura does this well. Let's start with the facts. Unless you are a fan of maybe horror, then the first episode of this series is just not good. Dare I say, it is by far the weakest episode in the entire season up until now. And I say this and I did keep watching. I don't know why, what compelled me. I guess I was curious about the other characters, since I knew from the synopsis this relied on multiple points of view, but still the first episode was just not interesting. There was nothing in my screen that made me excited to keep watching. You have this Yuri bait couple, which, knowing the tags, I immediately knew that something was going to happen to one of them, perhaps both of them, and it just did not surprise me when it happened. And also, the episode was so dense with world building and name dropping that everything went by so fast and it didn't really register with me. I could not get sufficiently attached to the characters on an emotional level so that I could have some sort of emotional reaction when the bad things do happen. And when the bad thing does happen on episode 1, it's so gruesome, it's almost unnecessarily so, almost like it's trying too hard to cause shock value with a relationship that hasn't been, in my view, properly established yet. And then we get introduced to Sojiro the Willow Sword, our first Shura, and he is just a generic psycho dude who loves to fight and is looking for a challenge. And I've seen this a million times, from Beelzebub to Hajime no Ippo to even Vinland Saga. It's just a bit overdone at this point. There wasn't any character trait that made him stand out, and I will say for a first episode the awkward CGI also certainly didn't help make a good first impression. The CGI in Ishura is at that mediocre mid-valley where it's not bad enough that it's unwatchable, but it's also not good enough where it's actually good, so it's just mid and very clunky at times. Fortunately for me, despite the very not ideal first impressions, I decided to keep watching because I was looking forward to the other characters and seeing if this show had something in it for me, and thankfully it did, because in my opinion, as I said, the first episode is the worst and the show gets better from the first episode onwards. We know fans will stick through bad CGI if the story and characters are interesting enough. Just look at Overlord Season 2 for example. So I am a bit disappointed that the first episode was just not good, because I think it lost a lot of fans right off the bat, because the first episode, in a way, it's so cliche that it almost borders parody and really doesn't play, in my view, into the strengths of this show. The next Shura that are introduced are way more interesting, and they are actually from this world. I say this because Sojiro was isekai'd, so he was an otherworlder, and so that makes him not a good vehicle for exposition. The next few episodes manage to make it much more seamless, the transition between exposition and character introduction, and making you care not just about the characters but about the intrigue in this world. And the rest of the cast is very diverse in a good way. It's very fun with a mix of everything. We have a murderous talking plant, we have a spider waifu, we have an elf that can speak things into existence, yes, that is as overpowered as it sounds, and we have a wyvern that talks and has 3 arms. Why does he have 3 arms? Nobody knows, but it sounds cool. The world is very colorful and very imaginative, and for fans of isekai and fantasy there will be at least one character that you will enjoy or connect with. And I do have to praise the author for his use of inhuman characters, because usually non-human characters are just anime girls with cat ears, which sure, they have cat ears, but it's not really super different from a normal human character, even in the way they're written. Here we have characters like wyverns and plants that have their own idiosyncrasies and are much more fun to watch. And I know there is a reason why authors don't use non-human characters often unless they're cute or sexy in a way they're not really marketable. No one is going to buy a wyvern pillow, I think, but still I do praise the author for writing the story that he wants to tell and not the story that he wants to sell. And speaking of characters, there are a lot of them and each one has a name and some sort of epithet that describes him in some fashion, or sometimes doesn't describe them at all. And because there are so many characters, they get increasingly hard to memorize and keep track of. And this is just a nitpick and obviously no fault of the author who wrote this in his original language, but the English translation for some of these names is just not it. Especially for me as a non-native speaker, some of the names are just confusing, like Dakai the magpie. What's a magpie? Higuare the pelagic. How do you even pronounce that? What does that mean? So I do appreciate the vocabulary that Ishura is providing to me, but it does make this humongous list of names to memorize very, very hard to keep track of. Regarding the gore element, this is very much from the Goblin Slayer school of shock the viewer the most in the first episode. I don't think the gore element ever really gets worse and more gratuitous than it does in the first episode, but I will say it does seem almost counterproductive the way it's used in this series. I don't mind gore in series, but I prefer when it's built up to, if that makes sense, when it's with characters that I already have some sort of emotional attachment to. Here it just feels all over the place, and so nothing really registers as truly bad, if that makes sense. The animation and soundtrack for this show are pretty forgettable. They're just middle of the pack. They're not super bad, but they're not good either. And honestly, I think it's a bit of a shame, because with a show like this, if you had good production value, I think this show could really make a splash. But unfortunately, even the opening is just super generic and forgettable. It's just one of those openings that are just mid, sung by some Japanese lady who I'm sure is a very nice lady. We're not saying bad things about the lady, but it's just, you know, I love anime openings, and if I skip one, it's because it's a bad sign. To me, the strongest aspects of Ishura are the variety of characters and the perhaps overly complex but fun world building. So I think this is actually one of those rare moments where I think that an anime director that was less faithful to the source material would have done a better job. Tone down the gore, maybe switch around the story so it still makes sense but you don't start your first episode with the bland swordsman, maybe have a more present narrator or more streamlined storytelling so the character introductions are smoother and easier to keep track of. And obviously better animation would greatly enhance the show with so many cool characters and fights, but better animation would benefit literally every show, so that's not even an observation. Honestly, this seems like the type of series that is better suited for longer form storytelling, especially because the type of fan that will enjoy this is the type of fan that is hyper obsessive and wants to know every detail. So while I cannot look you straight in the camera with a straight face and recommend you a light novel that I have never read, because that's just silly, I will say that in case some of you have read the light novel for Ishura, be sure to leave it in the comments and maybe prove my theory right or wrong. For the anime-onlys like me, unless you are a huge fan of fantasy or battle royales, then sure, go check this one out. Otherwise, this is just a mid-adaptation from perhaps overly ambitious source material, so I don't think you lose much on skipping out on this one. And this was it for me today, folks. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Ciao!